Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Psychoanalysis and Poetry here at the Poetry Project. I was talking to my friend, and I'm not going to steal the joke. I'm citing my friend here. And we were talking about how I was going to do the introduction tonight, and he was like, what if you had everyone raise their hand if their patients were here, and raise your hand if your analyst is here? So 3, 2, 1, close your eyes, do it. No, you don't have to do it. Okay, welcome. So happy to have you here. My name's Ethan Philbrick. I'm a curator in residence here at the Poetry Project. It's a big room. Sorry, it's not a big room. It's a big crowd in a small room. And so if we'll actually just do this. If somebody doesn't have a seat right now, who is like, it's going to be a problem to be here for the next hour and 20 minutes and not have a seat, please raise your hand. We've got some volunteers who will come and displace people who have chairs, and we can talk about it. Just talk with us. We'll be over here, and if you need a chair to make it through tonight, let us know. We can talk about it. Okay, so. Bathrooms are up this flight of stairs. There are 2 gender-neutral bathrooms up there. If you need them, feel free anytime. Let's get going. So tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce a night of readings and conversation with 2 leading psychoanalytic thinkers, Jamieson Webster and Hannah Zeavin. This evening is the second in an ongoing series of events excavating the relationship between poetry and psychoanalysis. The first in the series took place a year ago on April 18th in this very room and featured readings and conversation with Noir Al-Sadir and Claire Donato. It was a really wonderful night. And on that night, Columbia collaborated with the NYPD to brutally sweep the Gaza Solidarity encampment, and more than 100 protesters were arrested. And so on that night last year, here in the Parish Hall, we listened to Columbia Student Radio broadcasting from the encampment before and after the reading. Now, a year later, after the Columbia administration has colluded not just with NYPD officials in the Trump regime and ICE officers, but also ICE officers, we are all receiving news that a Louisiana judge has declared that Mahmoud Khalil, a lead organizer of the encampments at Columbia, can be deported for his political beliefs. While the fight for justice for Khalil continues in both the Court of Appeals and the street, I want to start tonight with a moment of silent reflection that I offer to you all as an opportunity to tune into the ways that you are and are not being called to show up, say, and do in this moment of heightened repression. Thank you. And to add to whatever came up for you, tomorrow there will be an all-out for Mahmoud emergency action in Times Square at 5 p.m. And so to our evening together here, psychoanalysis and poetry share a significant overlapping terrain. I want to start tonight by just hazarding 5 provisional points of contact between these 2 fields. 1, they are both modes of inquiry into language's capacity to deform and form us. 2, they both work with the negativity of language, with the beyond of sense, and with ruptures and breaks in meaning and narration. 3, they are both linguistic practices doggedly committed to speaking and listening to the corporeality of language. 4, they both have a tense relationship with political action, and while many attempt to wield them in service of politics, they often slip through or confuse the scene. 5, they both have complex relations to helping, to getting better, to amelioration. Do they soothe, or do they disturb in a soothing way? The format for tonight will be as follows. First, we'll have a reading from Hannah Zeavin, who is returning to the project after her first reading here at 17 years of age upon the publishing of her first book. And second, we'll have a reading from Jamieson Webster, a first-time guest of the project. And then after the 2 readings, they will join each other here. We'll take a moment to get some more microphones out. They will join each other here for a question and answer. So please, keep your notes and thoughts and try to arrive at that question that's truly a question. I ask, let the do some editing of your questions. probably your first 3 questions aren't actually questions, and after that emerges a question, and ask that one, you know? So, and so please join me in welcoming our first reader, Hannah Zeavin.
I'm shorter than Ethan. Ethan, thank you so much for everything you just said, firstly. And then secondly, for inviting us here together. It's overwhelming to be at the project, facing this way, which is disorienting to me, but also because it raised me in high school and afterwards. And immediately that makes me verklempt. So a note of thanks too to the friends who spoke to me for this talk. It's a very New York School talk, so I talked to a lot of people. And that includes David Kermani, who's John Ashbery's husband. Why I'm talking about John will be clear in a second. Emily Skillings, who is John Ashbery's friend and former assistant. Lytle Shaw, Noah Warren, Evan Kinley, and the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, which is increasingly actually doing very important work for all of us. The talk is for Jeffrey G. O'Brien, who is my lyric "You Always." The talk is called John Ashbery's Analyst. And I'll add also that it's not about the present, and I immediately chafe at that. I'm giving a very different talk on Monday that's about the present, but it is about another moment of severe repression as it was lived both in people and in their analyses, in a way. John Ashbery's Analyst. John Ashbery was analyzed by Carlos Carrillo. Jane Freilicher was analyzed by Edmund Bergler. Bernadette Mayer was in analysis with David Rubenfein. Kenneth Koch was analyzed by Rudolph Lowenstein. James Schuyler was hospitalized in Payne Whitney and Bloomingdale, where the day got started slowly. John Wieners was sent to Medfield and then sent us asylum poems. Was Barbara Guest analyzed? Someone told me she was, but she couldn't prove it. Alice Notley told me she was in treatment for a bit after Ted died. There's no information about Frank O'Hara being analyzed, no information about Amiri Baraka being analyzed, save for when Vivian Gorick imagined how it might go down in The Village Voice. We've long known psychoanalysts love poetry, though I think the jury is out on whether they, as a class, can be said to particularly love poets, whether as patients or not. But otherwise, psychoanalysis has been found guilty. We see it in the over-reliance on Keats' negative capability, Shakespearean drama as illustration of Oedipal conflict. And I can say all of that without going to Freud first, who basically owned it, that poets invented psychoanalysis. What we have looked at less is whether poets tend to love analysis, being analyzed, what use they make of it. On the one hand, we know poets, artists generally, tend to be afraid of the cure. Sublimation must hold. A friend, and like most of my friends, a poet, recently said to me, quote, "We all know that the poems get way worse after analysis, Hannah." Suffice it to say, he's not been analyzed, and his work remains excellent. However, correlation does not imply causation, or so they tell me. On the other hand, sometimes poets seek treatment precisely because they can't even make their art, anecdotally or from the archive. They're too depressed or drinking too much, so they might as well get free of the thing that spurs them to sublimation, sublimation now impossible. We know about HD, analyzed by Freud himself, but also Sylvia Plath, Muriel Reisiker, Elizabeth Bishop. I could go on. I could move on to the living, maybe in this room, but I won't. And anyway, to keep cataloging names, despite its formal pleasures, might not tell us much. Or the much it might suggest is that many poets who made it were white and middle class or richer, and Joseph Kaplan's kill list comes to mind. When we come to the New York School, what do we make of the fact that so many of that first generation, let alone the second, the third, were on the couch? In a way, nothing much, or nothing much more than I've stated. It makes perfect world historical sense, which is the kind of sense I'm tempted to make of this world, that in New York, it being a laboratory for psychoanalysis, both conservative and radical at mid-century, psychoanalysts and poets might mix, and that poets might mix with practitioners of the arts and vice versa. That at the height of Freud mania, some poets, especially those Harvard-educated, might go in for a bout of the talking cure. And anyway, poets tend to be verbal, and many analysts, not all, tend to like their verbal patients. So by one token, this one, there's nothing to do with the prevalence of analyzed poets sitting in the Cedar Tavern. But I won't tarry there, undermining my own argument before I've gotten a chance to make it, because it's also somewhat strange that when American psychoanalysis got so conservative, so deeply homophobic in particular, so violently so, more and more New York School poets, and particularly queer poets, turned, and I'll add, almost always voluntarily, to psychoanalysis. Oh, and it didn't make the poems worse. It made them. Ashbery had read Freud in college and had been on the couch before he turned to Carrillo. While an undergraduate at Harvard, Ashbery actively sought out analysis to do the one thing it promised it could do then in the United States, work as a conversion therapy. Ashbery wanted to become straight. This, we can thank God, ended when he couldn't afford the treatment. He also, according to Jimmy Schuyler, was quote unquote obsessed with the idea that someone was listening outside the door. This first treatment would have ended in 1949, as best I can reconstruct. And the next year, when he registered for the draft, Ashbery would do so as homosexual. From this view, we can see the contours of Ashbery's own deep ambivalence, who would last most of his life, about being thought of as gay, escorted through a world under the sign of this identity, even if he resolved his ambivalence about being gay and stopped trying to be something else. Ashbery's upset at being thought of as gay, especially as a gay poet, was something he wouldn't shed, at least, who knows what was in his mind, but at least into the 1990s, when he was still angry, and saying so, angry about Chaput's work on his poems, although Charles Bernstein reports that he would eventually begrudgingly offer, quote, well, I guess I am a role model. We might also hear this shift emerging as early as that ambivalent moment in 3 poems, quote, you are the mascot of that time, end quote. In the consulting room Ashbery couch surfed and left, we can likewise see the contours of the psychoanalysis we all know, and I hope we all hate, at mid-century, the moment psychoanalysis became ever more stereotyped as the image of itself in this country before it would give us all kinds of analysts, including queer left analysts like Richard Issay, who perhaps treated Ashbery's friend and co-author of The Nest of Ninnies, Jimmy Schuyler, down at Payne Whitney in New York. They overlapped, one analyst, one patient, so who's to say? So after one failed analysis, a failure in its own terms, a success, of course, in ours, in that it ended before too much damage could be done, Ashbery eventually sought another treatment, sometime in the 1960s. This was when he was back from France, but just to be as direct about it as the poet was himself, he was falling down drunk a lot. He would show up to dinner parties and leave before the food was served. He would get off a plane to give a reading and be too drunk to give it. And poets had to carry him down the gangway more than once. And he sought help in an analyst, someone never named in Ashbery scholarship. He's someone often called the Chilean or South American concert pianist, after how Ashbery spoke of him in interviews. So I got to work. It turns out this is Carlos Carrillo. Carrillo was an alcohol addiction specialist who, like the moniker might suggest to us, was also sad to be a psychiatrist and wished to just make his art. And Ashbery, in only referring to him as an analyst, as an artist, my slip, or quote, my shrink who is actually an artist, was perhaps also lowering the stakes of treatment while increasing the kind of mechanical solidarity that might be found in the consulting room with him. But Carrillo really was a shrink too, a former resident in psychiatry at Bellevue Hospital Center, and in '63, which might be the year Ashbery started treatment with him, he headed an alcoholism clinic for the Westchester Community Mental Health Service. Later, when he was affiliated with a Hillside Hospital in Queens, and then later again, St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital Center in Manhattan, where I was born, Ashbery remained Carrillo's patient until the doctor died in 1990. Carrillo, as far as I can tell, did not help John get sober. John wasn't sober, and not when I knew him, and I don't think he ever really was. But he did help John drink less, it seems, and helped him immensely in other interrelated modes, first a more structured treatment, and then eventually, David Cremani tells me, through something closer to friendship, that all-important New York School mode. And what did he help him with? Many things, we might presume. Sometimes the alcohol problem got renamed as writer's block, and sometimes Carrillo got remembered as a specialist in New York City for writers, perhaps because John started to send his friends to them. So Ashbery once apparently reported a conversation between the two in a session. Carrillo, so tell me what your daily schedule is. Ashbery, well, I wake up and I get up, and Carrillo, you do what? Ashbery, I get up. Carrillo, you must never, ever get up. Okay, pee and make a cup of coffee, but then get back in bed, if only for half an hour every day, and write longhand in a notebook. Are all the poets taking notes? Like, oh yeah, okay, there's the cure. Ashbery, why? Carrillo, that's where your inhibitions will still be low, and you'll be closer to your dreams. That's the surefire way out. Stay closer to your dreams. That's the surefire way out. Don't get up, stay down to become free. That is the principle of psychoanalysis. In this treatment, it seems that trying to write was contiguous with trying to find out who John was, in part because he was insistent that he didn't know who he was, couldn't put a finger on it between drastically different impressions that he could give off socially. After all, he declared, quote, I'm John. Ashbery writes the poems, splitting himself into the name of the Father and the Son, the poet and the person. To access the person who might write the poems, Carrillo once asked Ashbery to hand over his boyhood diaries, which Carrillo then subsequently claimed to have lost. Writing to Mark Ford, John would say, and he loved to use non sequiturs to begin letters or speech. My favorite was his reliance on the term incidentally. I use it all the time, but anyway, to the letter. This is John to Mark Ford. Oh, Faye, I mysteriously received some lost diaries of mine I wrote in high school. I'd lent them to my Chilean shrink 25 years ago, imagining that they might be helpful to my therapy. I don't think he ever looked at them, though, and then he told me he lost them, except for the first one. Then he died about 10 years ago. Last week, out of the blue, an antique dealer came to me at Bard saying he had some diaries of mine and did I want them back. He bought the contents of the shrink's apartment quite a long time ago and just happened on my diaries again. So then he came by and he gave them to me. It's like having a time capsule dropped on your head. I just looked at the one in 1941 to see what happened 60 years ago. Are you ready? Quote, John's quoting himself, quote, an art class in Rochester, one of my pictures was kept. It was a picture of Nazi boots crushing Holland tulips. Tulip time in Holland, 1940, end quote, of John quoting himself. And they say I don't have a social conscience. We hear John's frustration at his reception here, and it's something that Ashbery would remark upon across his life until he died, never settled about how he was seen, not quite able to get past it. Neither the queer role model younger men wanted him to be, as previously mentioned, nor happy to be seen as abdicating the political, and they say I don't have a social conscience. Relatedly to how he was perceived, both as a person and as a poet, John continued to have a problem with himself. Ashbery once said, quote, I don't like my voice. His analyst understood, and John understood himself as understanding, that the poems came from somewhere else. This Ashbery, although to that Ashbery would add, quote, my reason tells me that my poems are not dictated, that I am not voyant, end quote. It wasn't apparently his reason, though. It was the content of a fight, a protracted one that Ashbery and his analyst had. John felt he didn't author his own poems. His analyst was pretty sure he did. Eventually, we see the analysis all over this, as John would then describe the poems as coming from the, quote, part of myself that I'm not in touch with very much, except for when I'm actually writing, end quote. Another time he would say, quote, as far as my own poetry goes, while there's a lot of my unconscious mind in it, there's a lot of the conscious mind too, which is only normal, since we do sometimes think consciously, not very often, but sometimes, end quote. So this is to describe, I think, twice over, sublimation, a rather neglected concept in psychoanalysis, as anyone ever has, although I also love and will offer to you Jimmy Schuyler's notion, written from Payne Whitney, of the end of sublimation as being the beginning of thought, and thus the beginning of trouble. Quote, when I stop to think, the wires in my head cross, kaboom. So what do we know? Carrillo helped John manage the urge to drink somewhat. He helped him write. They discussed how and where that writing appeared and from where, and that where was inside. But what of the content? Yes, that too came from the sessions. With John and for John, Carrillo occasioned poems, like a lover or friend, or even the muse. And those poems, the ones we know about, that came from elsewhere, were not just sublimative in the sense of not being in touch with oneself while making art from the self one can't bear another way, but also John was given the instruction to work through, explicitly, repeatedly. So what was he to work through? His losses, a dead brother, a dead mother. The result? For the Ashbury heads in the room, one of them is 3 poems. I've already quoted it. Another that we know of is Flowchart, which Carrillo expressly demanded he write, and Ashbury did write, right at the end of his treatment to mourn his mother, not knowing his analyst would also die soon. The same year, in fact, the book appeared. We could make a case for a self-portrait in a convex mirror too, already analytic, written right there at the beginning of treatment. Quote, each person has one big theory to explain the universe, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And in the end, it's what's outside him that matters to him and especially to us who have been given no help whatsoever in decoding our own man-sized quotient and must rely on secondhand knowledge. It turns out that for Ashbury, the big theory was psychoanalysis, the process by which secondhand knowledge becomes first. Jane Freilicher was in treatment with Edmund Burglar, the author of books like Homosexuality, Disease or a Way of Life, Counterfeit Sex, Homosexuality, Impotence and Frigidity, and 1,000 Homosexuals. As this list of book titles might suggest, he thought queerness was a defense mechanism and not a good one. And if you don't know or can't guess, he was one of the most prominent US psychoanalysts on the topic of homosexuality, remembered as violently homophobic by my family friend, now passed Kenneth Lewis. And for our purposes, I would be deeply remiss not to say, and now you can dismiss it from your minds forever, that it was he who invented the term writer's block in his 1949 book, The Writer and Psychoanalysis. Freilicher's treatment with Burglar was, according to Evan Kinley, often a subject of jokes when Jane would write to John. For instance, quote, a 1959 letter that I love. I read a review of Dr. Burglar's new book in Time, and I'm mad at him for swiping the title I was planning to use in my memoirs, end quote. The book was probably Principles of Self-Damage, but possibly, and I hope, 1,000 Homosexuals. They both published that year. Bernadette Mayer, who has written the best description of the problem of psychoanalysis, a priori, quote, nothing outside can cure you, but everything's outside, was in analysis with David Rubenfein. But she wasn't just in analysand, she was deeply analytically inclined and significantly enough to dream about fucking the rat man, which I never, inclined. She read Freud, of course, but also Ferenczi, Lacan, and by the time she wound up on the couch in 1972, Rubenfein had also ended up on the couch for albeit different reasons. He was known to boundary violate. And Mayer said the two had an affair in the course of their treatment. Rubenfein was actively shunned for sleeping with Elaine May, the comedienne, as they referred to her then, who was his patient, then marrying her just weeks after his wife died by suicide. All of this happened by the time Mayer was his patient. So if Carrillo occasioned Ashbury's poems by telling him what to write through, Mayer wrote an entire book about writing to and for her analyst. This became Studying Hunger Journals, about which she wrote, I wanted to try and record like a diary in writing states of consciousness, my states of consciousness as fully as I could, end quote. She did this all the time across 2 notebooks. When she wrote in one, Rubenfein had the other. She color-coded her feelings, and she wrote a great deal about, well, sex, the sex dreams, like, of Ratman. And the radical out there workbooks of her own analysis became her breakthrough book. It's when she was finally admitted into the New York school, and the sign of it was that Ashbury blurbed it. Kenneth Koch was analyzed by Rudolf Lowenstein. Lowenstein is deeply important to the history of psychoanalysis, analyzed by Hans Sachs, sent to France to bring psychoanalysis there by Freud himself, where he trained the first 2 generations of French analysts before then again fleeing the Vichy government and settling in New York. There he became the imago of what is called ego psychology, working at the most conservative institute in New York, at NIPSI, and holding the presidency of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Perhaps no other analyst, we could try and do this work, exerted as much influence across such different terrains in the nascent and then maturing field. This also means, of course, that Kenneth Koch and Jacques Lacan were analytic siblings. Correaux may have occasioned Ashbery's poems, but Koch would write an occasional poem, quote unquote, to psychoanalysis in his last book, 50 Addresses, a pun on both the New York address and the occasional form itself. Published in 2000, first in the New York Review of Books before being collected, the poem begins like every bad O'Hara copy, with a subway trip on the 6 train, up Lex, but the destination is a time. You always have to twist it. Quote, to arrive at you in your glory days of the 1950s when we believed that you could solve any problem. This is the poem's addressee. It's a psychoanalysis of the 1950s. Quote, I dreamed exclusively for you. I was not to make important decisions. This was perfect. I never wanted to. On the Harturu surface of emotions, your ideas sank in so that I could play again. But something was happening. You gave me an ideal of conversation, entirely about me, but including almost everything else in the world. But this wasn't poetry, it was something else, end quote. And while this poem may be evidence for my friend's hypothesis that poems do indeed get less good, if not bad, after analysis, let's stick with it. Quickly, the poem becomes a to and of and from and for his analyst, and also the scene of termination. But which termination? Quote, after 2 years of spending time in you, years in which I gave my best thoughts to you and always felt you infiltrating and invigorating my feelings, 2 years at 5 days a week, I had to give you up. It wasn't my idea. Quote, I think you are nearly through, Dr. Lowenstein said. You seem better. But light, comedy, tragedy, energy, science, balance, breath. I didn't want to leave you, I cried. I sat up, I stood up, I lay back down, I sat, I said, but I still get sore throats and hay fever, quote, and someday you're going to die. We can't cure everything, end quote. So Koch wrote the poem, and not long after he did die. Something analysis can't cure, perhaps along with some instances of hay fever and some sore throats. Of occasional poems, my friend Noah Warren, who happens to be the world's expert on the form, thank you, Noah, says, quote, the occasional poem is beset by an ontological flicker, a nagging insubstantiability. It leads our readings away from itself, back from the text to the history and sociality it subordinates itself to. And additionally, Noah says, quote, we read for values such as wit, utility, conversation, and lightness, end quote. I would say, in a way, we read for the low-hanging signature of the New York school. The occasion here is termination, and occasions in address not to Dr. Lowenstein, who did die in 1975, and whose words at the point of termination are quoted, but to the discipline itself, a lyric compensation for the loss of intimate speech sent wide to the practice like poems are eventually sent to a public. We might add that this is the moment psychoanalysis was lost. I hear it's back, but it was lost, even if analysis was lost a quarter century prior, which is to say, lost as a social form. We might add that the poem Morning Psychoanalysis itself was published in the New York Review. In the same era, in the same issues, it was publishing missives from the Freud Wars, namely the side hell-bent on killing Freud, the charge led by Fred Cruz. We don't know if Koch chose to publish it there for this reason. But if poetry is meant to be overheard, unlike the protected speech of analysis, then this poem about analysis means to let us overhear the session right when many of us thought there might not be any more. We have these dyads, these couples, the poet as lyric I and their lyric you, the analyst and the analysand, and here we have them together. Both are understood as exclusive, the poet and their poem, the analyst and their analysand, but both psychoanalysis and poetry are actually highly social mediums. It's why Ethan wanted you to disclose if your shrink was in the room. And by the way, at the Parapraxis party we had here, oh my God. But psychoanalysis and poetry are these social mediums, and by which I might mean several things, but just now I just mean the casual way. They rely on milieu, referrals, sociability, and so on. I can't go on. It's time for Jameson to get up here. I don't have time to follow Jimmy Schuyler and John Wieners into the asylum and out of it. I can't talk more about the New York School painters and their treatments, about the milieus of art and poetry as they cross both these repressive and also radical and also cultic psychoanalyses in New York. I don't have time to tell you what Alice told me, but you can ask me after. I do have time to say this. The New York School does this and it does that, and yes, one of the things it does in its poems, but also to make them, is psychoanalysis. Thank you.
tough act to follow. I have to, I started an organization when I was a candidate in psychoanalysis called, with the, the worst name possible, unpronounceable, called Das Unbehagen, which means discontent. It's from Freud's Civilization as Discontents, because I was so unbelievably unhappy as a candidate. And at the New York Psychoanalytic, where Rudolf Lowenstein landed at the end, it should be known that Lacan said this man understood nothing about me, or he could hear nothing. It's probably more like that. I have this kind of show and tell presentation that is in two parts. This is my giving you the overview. One was, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the moments that were important in the writing of this book on breathing that crossed over with questions of poetry or writing more generally. And then the other was to read the end of the book, which is a personal scene about my relationship to listening and to speech in the makings of a psychoanalyst. And part of the reason that I've chosen to present things this way is because in some instance of this book, I think I collected all of the poetry that I loved that spoke to breathing. And then at a certain moment, I thought, I can't do anything with this for the reason that Hannah said. I mean, Freud said that poets invent psychoanalysis, so then I should just make a collection of poems. I should not write this book. So in a way, it was there as inspiration, and it was put aside. And I didn't want to describe or analyze poems to anyone to talk about what I wanted to speak about in relationship to breathing and psychoanalysis. That didn't make a huge amount of sense. Poems aren't there to be analyzed or used as fodder for theory. So there's a scene of psychoanalysis and poetry that exists in relationship to this book as absent. So instead, this is my presentation. Freud in Civilization and Its Discontents, Das Unbehagen, wrote that writing was in its origin the voice of an absent person, and the dwelling was a substitute for the mother's womb, the first lodging for which in all likelihood man still longs and in which he was safe and felt at ease. This moment is important in the book because one of the discoveries that I made in looking at the history of breathing and psychoanalysis was a whole world in which, around the question of birth trauma, and of course the first breath, that analysts got into a huge argument with Freud. Freud was suspect of placing anxiety and first breath and trauma as the sort of crucial moment, as if what an analysis would do was bring us back there, and then you get like primal scream therapy and reliving your birth trauma. And he said, no, there are so many other absences and losses and confrontations with trauma, and we need to read forward. We don't want to read backwards. And there were many instances in which the idea of analysts to kind of talk about this longing for the womb, he said, it's not that we have a problem with longing for the womb, but he wanted them to stop. He sort of said, like, no more of this, you guys. And this was his fights with Otto Rank, with Jung in a certain respect, with Sender Ferenczi, who vouched for Otto Rank, and certainly with Wilhelm Reich at a later point in time. But I just want to put that in the background as both the question of writing and the question of longing for a place where we feel safe and at home. Another moment that was important to me is this moment from Lacan's Littérature. I have some of my colleagues here. We just read this completely impossible text. I don't recommend it to anybody. I will read this quote to you. I shed light on psychoanalysis by demonstrating where it makes holes. There's nothing illegitimate about that. Holes have borne fruit, as we have known for a long time, in optics as well as in the most recent physics, that involving the photon. Psychoanalysis could better justify its incursions into the field of literary criticism by adopting this method, which would mean that literary criticism would in fact be renewed by psychoanalysis' existence, text being measured against it precisely insofar as the enigma remains on its side, staying silent. It's a really beautiful text, Littérature. You could think of it as Lacan's Gaia moment, in which he asks a question not so much about the unconscious, but about our relationship to the earth and to terrain and to space. And part of what he does in this text, which is an argument both with Derrida and with Barthes at that moment where they were sort of, I don't know, doing some French jostling thing that they like to do. This is his reply. And it's really interesting at this moment to take the question of writing and make it a question of our relationship to space and land. And what he does in the text is he says that what psychoanalysis is interested in is what he calls the littoral. And by that he means, on the one hand, you have something like land and civilization, and on the other hand, you have something like the sea and enjoyment. And he says, I think psychoanalysis is interested in the place where these two things meet, constantly creating a space that you look to find something permanent. You look to find the place where they hit up against each other, but you can never quite see it. And what you do, in fact, find are things that wash up. Garbage. Really. And he says, you know, there's something about this. And he would place psychoanalysis, I think, and writing and poetry on the side of the people who picked up what is left on the ground from the clash of these two forces. Someone who became important to me in the writing of this text, and then I didn't know him, but he wrote me an email and it made me cry. I love this story, Café Lou. This is Ben Lerner, if you don't know the story. It's about choking. And so I thought a lot about breath and choking from this story. He wrote, I've always thought that there was sadism haunting the question, are you choking? Since the one who still draws breath and can form it into speech demands from the person who is choking a response they cannot give. Regardless, choking is a uniquely human drama, a definitional drama for the homo loquens, a drama at the heart of the human, or rather at the larynx, the voice box, which, as we evolve, move lower and lower, enabling us to generate a long column of vibrating air we can shape into meaning with our mouth parts, shaped air that might in turn build and shape a world. But this evolutionary speech advantage required that the space in our bodies for breathing and swallowing be shared. The formal capacity for speech comes with the risk of choking to death, something only humans frequently do. Part of what was very important to me in the book was to bring the question of breathing. I read all of these books on philosophy and Eastern religion on breathing, and I had to bring breathing and speaking together because this is what was missing to me in the research that I was doing on it. And it also made breathing something much, much stranger than it can be in a lot of the more philosophical and theological kind of ruminations on breath. And it really is both a question of poetry on the one hand, or what we do with language, or how language is very strange to us, and on the other hand, the trials of a body. Because if you think about breathing and if you think about speaking, it's the tongue and it's the teeth and it's the air and it's the nose and it's the throat and it's the larynx and it's the esophagus and it's this vibrating column of air, and as we know from Ben Lerner, it's choking. At the very end of his story, as he's choking and he's sort of pleading with the gods to let him live, this is what he writes. Early in my career as a choker, I believed I would narrate my way back to the world of the breathing, and that language would save me. But now I swore desperately, yes, if I am allowed to live, I will tell no one what has happened to me, and starting with that silence, I will learn the way of silence. I will no longer manically ingest and express, will neither tempt fate nor attempt to evade it with talk. Please. I was surprised in my last moments on earth as I was flooded with terror and love that I had the mental space to note how the world failed to conform to my expectations of it. That nobody around us in the restaurant seemed aware of what was happening, how was it possible that no waiter had appeared and that people around us were still drinking and laughing and eating and generating columns of vibrating air at their tables. Of course, the irony of the story is that he publishes it in the New Yorker and he does not go the way of silence, which I think is always probably the problem that we face in writing, as much as we'd like to disappear into it. And of course, this was a big question for Lacan, right? One of the journals that he published, he wanted it to be, the unsigned, that you wouldn't know who wrote these texts. Of course, his name is everywhere. I mean, you knew which ones were his. But this idea of somehow disappearing from what you write became very important, as if you could absent yourself from it. But you can't. It's impossible. I owe like a huge debt to this book, Breathing Chaos and Poetry. It was written very, very early, Franco Bifo Berardi, and I just wanted to put that up there. He writes, Deleuze and Guattari describe the relation to poetry to chaos. In a violently poetic text, Lawrence describes what produces poetry. People are constantly putting up an umbrella that shelters them, and on the underside of which they draw a firmament and write their conventions and opinions. Poets, artists make a slit in the umbrella, they tear open the firmament itself to let a bit of free and windy chaos and to frame in a sudden light a vision. Reading these lines, I cannot help but recall Wittgenstein's famous sentence in the Tractatus, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. Poets cut the fabric of the umbrella, and their incision discloses the unbearable vision of the true firmament, and the poet's action is literally apocalyptic. So again, you hear in both this quote and the quote from Lacan the question of what makes a whole again, right? I mean, so for them, there's something interesting both about writing and absence and what makes a whole that allows something to appear or what's disappeared to appear. This is from the book. Berardi with Guattari sees the breathing spasm of poetry as throwing us out of time, especially already established communal modes of experiencing time and the rhythms of life. Spasms, which, by the way, in sex and breathing, the diaphragm and the esophagus spasm. So we're being very literal here. Spasms thus invite us to step into something singular and new, as if we both step out of time and back into it, experiencing it afresh. This would be the possibility of envisioning another rhythm to life. Berardi's emphasis on the new is refreshing, flying in the face of New Age thought understood as a return to some ancient wisdom. Because there's a lot with the breathing that's like getting back to the authentic, original, pre-birth traumatic breath. And it really was the question of poetry and language that helped me like dig out of this and move forward. And Berardi was someone who was guiding me there. These manifestations of breathing spasms are an energic disruption and a repatterning. This is just a quote I love. There's so much Ingeborg Bachmann. There's some of it in the book more in relationship to what she had to say about the repressive moment in which she was living that I sort of bring back with the question of COVID and what followed since then, and forms of asphyxiation that are even worse than when I was writing the book. Whoever writes poetry engraves forms in our memory. The Austrian poet Ingeborg Bachmann once wrote, and I believe that whoever inscribes these forms also disappears into them with his own breath, which he offers as the unrequited proof of these forms' truth. Again, the question of disappearance appears. I've always felt that psychoanalysis is closer to poetry than to narrative, especially if narrative is used in the service of explanations. In psychoanalysis at its best, the basic forms and sounds of language feel fluid and ephemeral, never quite solidifying into anything like my story, single and permanent. And finally, I read the Meridian speech as therapy probably every year, so I just have this here. Poetry is perhaps this, a breath turning, a turning of our breath. Who knows, perhaps poetry goes its way, the way of art, for the sake of just such a turn. And since the strange, the abyss and Medusa's head, the abyss and the automaton all seem to lie in the same direction, it is perhaps this turn, this Atemwende, which can sort out the strange from the strange. It is perhaps here in this one brief moment that Medusa's head shrivels and the automatons run down. Perhaps along with the eye, estranged and freed here in this matter, some other thing is also set free. I think I read this because it's also my hope for psychoanalysis. I will explain this in a minute. All right, this is the TMI moment. Freud once described a hysterical patient who had a fear of seeing people talking in an excited manner inside shops and developed agoraphobia. In his case known as the Rat Man, who we now know that who dreamed of having sex with him? Bernadette Mayer dreamed of having sex with the rat man. In his case, known as the rat man, Freud's patient recalled lambasting his father as a child with the only words he knew: you plate, you table, you lamp, and stopped him mid-spanking. His father then uttered the powerful words, he'll either be a great man or a criminal, words that seemed to mark him symptomatically. His intense libidinal speech had created a bifurcated prophecy that made him doubt all his decisions. In fact, in most of Freud's cases, you'll find a scene of speech, like when his young hysterical patient Dora was told by her father's mistress's husband, "My wife means nothing to me," and she suddenly slapped him because she loved this woman, and she had tolerated this strange situation of having to tend to these others on behalf of her father. The words, like a release from a magic spell, lifted a veil after which she overturned the entire apple cart. When I looked at my childhood, an ocean of silence in my past appeared before me. I was, it is true, a quiet child. I didn't say much, I didn't complain, I didn't speak really. I wasn't fundamentally there. As Kathy Acker writes in Empire of the Senseless, for a long time I had remained apathetic, so sure that my words meant nothing to anyone that I no longer spoke unless circumstances forced me to. In 6th grade, I didn't make it into the school play, more public speaking, and my teacher, surmising that something was very off, asked to talk to me. I put my head down on the desk, and I wouldn't look at them. They were trying to be kind, but they hadn't realized that they had touched something fundamental. The question of speaking was funneled into a childhood obsession with parrots. I wanted a baby hyacinth macaw that I could teach to talk. I was keenly aware that this is what a parrot can do that no other pet can. There was a yellow accent at the eyes and mouth of the otherwise monochromatic deep blue of the bird. I see some proto-image of myself, my eyes staring at the other's mouth, my mouth fearing the gaze of the other. The gaze and voice are the most immaterial of the erogenous zones whose objects vaporize into thin air. I would ride my bike to the parrot jungle, a tourist attraction near my house, where I would marvel at the birds and talk to them. They were awaiting my visits, I imagined. I looked longingly at them on their perches from the on-site cafeteria. A parrot that we had when I was a child used to scream the name of my nanny exactly as I screamed it. Emma! It echoed through my neighborhood. Another peculiarity of my life, I was raised by a nanny who didn't speak English and who was only educated until age 7 in the Philippines. She had false teeth that she took out every night and put in a glass next to our bed on the floor, which made her even more incomprehensible. The joke, not funny, was that I was the only person who could understand her. I witnessed a lot of arguing, a lot of vicious speech as a child. I was a child who was talked at. My maternal grandmother used to say that my father had diarrhea of the mouth and that he talked until you surrendered. This condemnation was part of her verbally assessing most people that she knew, and I was caught in the crossfires of speech that condemned others' speech that diagnosed other people's speaking, none of it speaking to. These are the makings of a psychoanalyst. I also developed the habit of going dead in the face of my father's talking. I would put my head down, curl into a ball, close my eyes until he stopped. And I must have wondered why he kept going, even with this display of finding something unbearable, of not listening and disappearing. But I don't remember wondering. I only remember having extreme reactions when he came home from his trips. I began to surmise that I carried around a question about those who don't stop talking when you've already stopped listening, realizing it was my lightning rod, physiologically electric. I was, as they like to say about patients in the hospital, agitated, also very impatient. The opposite reaction could also manifest with force. In the face of someone whose speech I wanted to hear, I was immediately and dangerously in love. It's important to understand that despite remembering all of this, I could neither remember having a question about being listened to, nor could I remember my father's voice. I couldn't hear his tone, I can't remember his way of speaking, but I know it drove me crazy. How could this be this repressed? I certainly searched for speech worth listening to. I love speech that was subtle, careful, attentive to its listener, rarely demonstrative. When necessary, I like speech that could strike hard with surgical concision. Speech could be wild and messy, rambling and digressive if its listener was kept in mind. There had to be an eye for timing and tact. What am I asking for? You are what I want to hear. This search for an ideal is both a capacity and a massive defense. The capacity is certainly a large part of whatever abilities I might have as a writer and teacher, but it's backed by a monstrous scene of judgment, a defensive wall that hadn't been broached, at least not yet, or not then. While many think of psychoanalysis as the excavation of trauma, sexual and aggressive scenes that overwhelm, the dimension of breathing and speaking has been a subtle and subterranean presence. Breathing takes us to an unpredictable kernel of speech, the breaking point between a body and a world. For Lacan, language is the primal scene. Even when it comes to real events, there is always what people say, what they don't say, and what is unsayable that we have to negotiate. I think we forget that when young, we were terrified by all those adult people speaking, Charlie Brown, knee height, and those voices going wah, 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 wah. Having just learned to speak, you are close to how little is ever understood of what others say, close to the question of what people say and why they say it, especially to you. Children have a raw sense of what is forbidden, what must be said to appease, and this excess in the exchange of words we simply can't ever get our heads around. Lacan elevated the poetic, musical, and tonal qualities present in speaking, and the analyst needs to have the widest repertoire around language ready to hand. Relinquishing control over speaking also dethrones the task of understanding. Let the speech pour out of you, let this torrent of air blow over you. Aren't symptoms embodied by a relationship to speech the real heart of psychoanalysis? Isn't this human sensitivity what we see so powerfully in psychosis that can't figure out how to stop hearing something monstrous about voices? In my time on the couch, I have come to know speech that is blocked, helpless speech, speech that wants freedom it can't yet have, speech that is shorn of libido, repetitive speech, speech that is marvelously abstract, speech that is excessively label, erotic speech, sensual speech, speech that gets lost in detail and digression, a maze, speech that degenerates into crying, speech that's always screaming, furious speech, speech caught in understanding, speech that never feels finished, speech that happens too fast, speech filled to the brink with demands, speech that never reaches itself, wanting to stop speaking, not speaking. I developed my only new symptom in analysis during these language lessons, a tic where I would hear things at a lag, respond with an even longer lag, which made people, especially certain loved others, repeat things to me. I didn't want to hear what they said the first time, no less a second or a third, and I wanted to scream, stop. Scream that I always hear. Who exactly was I screaming at? In retrospect, I embodied all sides of my nightmare, taken for not listening and needing to be talked at. My early childhood symptom of asthma felt as if it dissolved into this Janus face of language, language that's always filled with anxiety and ecstasy, care and carelessness, a perturbance of life and a deadly abyss. I'm lucky that psychoanalysis took an original symptom, a real bodily diffusion, and battled with this multi-headed beast, shoving me into this difficult scene of speaking. My daughter will be Generation Alpha, starting at the beginning of the alphabet, hopefully rewriting it all again. I think of my analyst, closer in age to my father, the silent generation. She stayed true to form. Mostly she was silent. She never tried too hard to understand me, and in my attempts to understand myself, doctor, heal thyself, she sometimes showed concern. Maybe I intimate a little pity. I saw her grow old. Did she understand me? The wish to be understood, writes Adam Phillips, may be our most vengeful demand, may be the way we hang on as adults to our grudge against our mothers, the way we never let our mothers off the hook for their not meeting our every need. Wanting to be understood as adults can be our most violent form of nostalgia, our wish for a more perfect womb. Thank you.
Thank you both. That was so wonderful. We'll just take now like 2 minutes to reset up the stage and then come back. So I would recommend not leaving, but if you want to get up and take a moment and we'll have a little conversation. Thank you. So wonderful. Okay. Keep it simple.
Yeah. Okay. I'm excited.
Yeah, I love psychology and poetry, so yeah. And I didn't know there were relationships today.
Really?
I did not at all. I didn't even know what a psychoanalyst was until I learned this a week ago. I never knew that it existed as a form of therapy.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I just thought psychodynamic therapy was all that existed based on Freud. So much to learn.
Well, thank God for this event.
I know.
I almost might, yeah. Almost, but I did it.
You made it.
Is this one? Yeah. Okay, we're gonna jump back in so that we can all go out into our Friday evening as well. So before we get going, can we just have another round of applause for Hannah and Jameson? I've in our little planning moment before this, it was decided that I would ask a first sort of like synthesizing question to get us started, and I'm now really regretting that I agreed to do that, and so I'm having all of my sense of impossibility and anxiety. But no, I mean I think okay. So here's what I want to ask. I'm going to address you both as poets now. Okay, so as poets, I mean, Hannah, you have published poetry, you work in poems, my sense, well, you can answer this, not so much anymore, there's been a shift, but and then Jameson, I was really struck in the end of the Disorganization and Sex book, that section that's all these little fragments. That was actually what I was reading when I was writing this invitation to you. I was reading that and I was like, these poems, these like amazing psychoanalytic little poems, so in that I'm addressing you both as poets, but I'm curious to my question is actually sort of like about writing and method, and in the writing of these could be your text for tonight or just a more broader meditation on your own writing practice, but where does your reading of psychoanalysis, clinical experience with psychoanalysis, like surface in your actual like relation with the page and in writing and in your own formal experiment? Because I experienced both, and tonight we had things on more of like the critical, historical, philosophical line, but inside them all also formal experiment and sentence and interruption and register shift and all these different things. And so where of like tonight's questions around psychoanalysis and poetry, like where do they come up for you in the actual scene of composing and writing, and how do they surface there?
5,000.
Oh, try now. Try
Hello,
now.
hello, no, hello.
There we are. Well, you're
Is it
in
working? Is it? Oh. I mean, like any, like any analysand here or poet here, you probably have voice notes, right? You probably have these or memos, or you just have like this collection. Mine happens to have a lot of patient notes in it as well. But I mean, I have notes from my analysis. I have my dream diary. I have patient notes on what I'm reading, and that all becomes the text somehow. But I do have to say there is something strange or particular, I think, about the life of a psychoanalyst. So one, I listen to all these people extensively for hours and hours. There's that practice. I teach. I used to teach undergrads. I teach graduate students now. I teach psychoanalysts. I supervise. So there's something about listening to someone listening, which is different. I write for public consumption. I write for professional reasons to other analysts. I write in different contexts, if it's an art context. So this is like a crazy stretching of yourself. And I think that this book is probably the result, or maybe Disorganization and Sex, but that's like a long collection of things over a decade. But I think this book is the result of that 20-year stretching. Yeah.
Ooh, this question, and I loved your answer. What was coming to mind, not while you were speaking, but while you were asking, was like, I definitely don't want to talk about being a poet. Although I recently wrote a poem for the first time in many years because I was in Algeria in the Sahara with Jake and Ari and a few friends who aren't here, although one's watching on Zoom, and we didn't have our phones for 6 days, no internet, and I wrote a 9-page poem. It's like, maybe there is something to the fact that phones are evil. I kind of want to answer just directly where I felt very lucky. Recently, I went and had a single session with Thomas Ogden. And I live in Oakland, even though I grew up here. And we had a long conversation, it felt like, and then he sort of was like, okay, kid, what do you want to ask me? And I said to him, Dr. Ogden, that's a bit like asking, what do I want to ask God? And if I were asking God a question, I would ask, what is the meaning of life? Because that's what I've been told to ask. But with Dr. Ogden as God, it would be, how do you become more alive? Which is what his work centers on. And he said, well, Sigmund Freud has an answer, and the answer is in dreaming. And he talked about that for a minute. I was like, yeah. And he was like, and Winnicott has an answer, and it's about play. And I was like, yeah, and he talked about that for a minute. And he said, I have the sense that for you, it's writing. And so I think for me that I've worked as a writer in many different ways. I have not your stretch. I'm like really tired now here and supervising and. But I have my own stretch, and so like I work as a historian, and even in the book that's for sale here, I say like, and I don't work psychoanalytically, but you can't get away from it because since I was a very little girl, it is sublimation, it is an under-theorized concept, and that's what's always happening.
Beautiful. We're now gonna, this will be a sort of improvised collective performance of passing this mic around, because there are so many of us in this room and it is on a cord. But we'll figure it out, each question by question. So, but we'll get started. So do we have a first question for Jameson and Hannah? I know I was sort of scary at the beginning about asking a question, but you saw me struggle, so now we all get to struggle, you know? Anybody want to start us off?
There's the hand over.
We have a hand. Oh, and you're so easy to get the mic to. I love that.
Warming up.
Well, Hannah, you obviously edit Parapraxis, and it's like a leftist magazine. And Jameson, in your book, you were kind of skeptical of, or if I'm reading it right, you were skeptical of the ability of psychoanalysis to be utilized or kind of taken for social change. And I'm curious about like what the role of poetry and psychoanalysis and like speech acts in general, maybe polemical speech acts, has to like political social change.
Was I skeptical of its value for? No, I think there's a lot of political theorists who use psychoanalysis, and it can be used, as you know, in all different directions. And I think that the discourse, the political discourse, as a discourse is different from what it means to be a psychoanalyst and to speak about the practice of psychoanalysis. So I just want to recognize that gap, and that the question of how it's used or deployed has to be asked about. And I always say, you know, we work 1-to-1-to-1. And I would, you know, or, you know, you could be a group therapist and then you maybe work with 10. But we have a size problem in that respect. And I always, you know, with my students, I say, I don't know. I mean, it's not for me, I think, to say how you scale it up or speak about it. And if it's useful to you, by all means, it's, you know, it's free and open to the public. But I can't make that leap. Yeah.
I mean, this is a question where my answer would really depend on the day. Like, truly, I am ambivalent. At the magazine, which you gestured to, we think all the time about what it would mean to have left psychoanalysis for the 21st century, which means thinking about its leftist tradition in the 20th century. And Jameson has a lot of work on this, including a piece that we'll publish very soon. You know, like, so much of the leftist tradition has been hived off, hidden away, remaindered, called not psychoanalytic, so therefore split from psychoanalysis. So the one thing the magazine tries to do is think about that in the present, but also both excoriate the error of its conservative history and recover its left history, which we do have. And I think that that's actually, I'm dodging the question by saying where I ended up when I left poetry was going to history, because actually that's where I found that power. On the other hand, I'm always tempted to quote Lauryn Hill. Lauryn Hill, how are you gonna win if you ain't right within? And I do actually think that one thing analysis gives us is a little bit that edge. And I think everyone in this room probably has real energy, wish, desperation, has fought to win. And I do think that psychoanalysis has a role to play in thinking about movement strife, individuals. And that's one way it can directly show up right now, away from its own sort of self. But we do need the left and the radical theory in order to do that work. Otherwise, you're Ashberian analysis 1 and not Ashberian analysis 2.
Thank you.
After this, we'll go elsewhere, but yeah.
Hi. Both of you alluded to the absence or the whole, like the absence of words and the space that takes up. I would love to know your thoughts on what you think the current, what's the word I'm looking for? The current administration, I'll just go out and say it. The current administration, with how it's limiting free speech and limiting the words that people can use, it kind of reminds me of, Jameson, I think what you said about whether you're meant to stay silent or like what meaning do your words have. I've kind of been questioning this is more context to the question, but I've kind of been wondering, like, what value do my words have in a society where words of everyone in the world is just being crushed and dominated? I wonder what the psychoanalytical and like the poetic impact is of an administration essentially policing words and knowledge.
I want you to ask Jameson as Dr. Webster, because all of the clinicians I know, even if their practices are largely like as if the world doesn't exist, are flooded by the world. I can't answer that question clinically. I can answer it as a university professor. The answer is devastating. And yet people are finding a way across very, very, very different forms of vulnerability. And so I think the other thing that comes to mind is this book I've been starting to read. I find it actually too difficult. Like, I really have to read it like pages at a time, if that, which is a book of dreams that were smuggled out of Nazi Germany.
A piece by Zadie Smith on the...
Okay, I haven't seen. I'll look. Where I'm like, it goes back to the Ogden point, right? Which is like, yes, in language. This is not to say, and let's stop talking, let's just dream. Not at all. But actually, like, the political is suffusing everything. And I'm really curious about how it's showing up on your couch, because I don't have one.
It's a space where you can speak. I don't know if people are afraid that the surveillance technology makes it in the room. Maybe I should get a lock box in the waiting room for us to deposit our computers and phones, but I think it's really important that you have a space where you try to speak when you feel the most devastated by outside forces, by closer to home forces. And I think it means a lot to people to come. But I actually find that a lot of people are saying, I don't want to waste my time talking about this shit, which is interesting. Like this is my time, and if I start, I won't stop, so I need to bracket and try to do something else right now. And somehow that feels right to me. Like what it's taking from us in terms of our attention and our feeling of possibility, and then trying to find a new place to begin.
Thank you.
Thank you for those beautiful talks. I have a question for both of you. Well, the first part of the question is for Hannah. What was this 9-page poem you wrote in the desert, and what was it about? And that kind of led me to my general question about the conditions under which we are able to write. You mentioned not having your phone for 6 days, which I found 4.5. Really? Oh, 4.5?
Not by the time we got back. Wasn't it like 5.5, 6 days, no internet? Once we got to Jeanette, we could debate this later. We have witnesses.
Which I find fascinating, but I've always thought about this question in relation to the work of Marion Milner, who writes about, different states of consciousness and moving between them. So like a kind of sinking and coming to the surface, a dilation, a concentration. So there's an oscillation in her psychoanalytic theory of creativity. So I was wondering if you have
writes about breathing.
Yes, a psychoanalytic theory of creativity.
Before I tell you about my poem, I want to say to this entire room that a truly remarkable book is about to come out in May by Akshi Singh on Milner. In Defense of Leisure is Akshi's book, and it's stunning. So, whatever, please go read it, buy it, request it at whatever your bookstore is or your library, because Akshi's work is exactly about that. And I'm like, let's go read her. She's so great on it. And it's a really, really beautiful, intense, valiant book, and I can't recommend it enough. The poem is about the pleasure of the horizontal, but also at the same time, the reason I thought it was longer than perhaps it was is also like the first time I hadn't talked to my child ever. I have a 5-year-old who's home with his dad, and that was like very strange to be, what? When I was in Algeria, thank you, Mom. My son was home with my husband. Thank you. Jesus, being fact-checked live by your own family is a fucking nightmare. And she was wrong. But yes, currently, his grandfather is watching him. Fuck. Tough crowd. Anyway. But it was about the pleasure of the horizontal, and it was also about the pleasure of being back in full human history. There was so much happening. We're also waiting to hear about the ceasefire without phones as 5 people and also as 11 people. And it's being published, so I'll send it to you, which is very weird to me. But Marion Milner and Akshi Singh's book that's coming out, I think will be stunning, and anyone who loved or liked or disagreed with us will find extraordinary value in that text.
Your question speaks to the lingering problem of sublimation and whether psychoanalysis makes you not write poetry or write terrible poetry after you were a really amazing poet. And I think that a lot of analysts in the period of time that you describe in particular really took their interpretive ideas very seriously and went in just like a hammer and, I'm going to take this apart. I'm going to tell you what's going on. I'm going to hammer the interpretation into you. And I think this is a confusion. I think they were confused. And I think what you were describing is very beautiful, actually, this idea that part of what analysis does is it frames the possibility of having very different states of consciousness and learning to move between them, and the analyst really helps you do that. And the frame does. It's not even the analyst. It's something about the frame, the coming, the speaking, the lying down, the repetition of that, the deep listening.
One more point on Milner, and I think this too, when I was listening to you also, Jameson, just now, which is that Milner and analysis, so you're saying your patients are saying this is this zone of being free. I'm reminded, of course, that Ashbury did think someone was outside the door listening, but also about the amateur is something that Milner is theorizing, is like not having to be good at, not in the Winnicott sense, like just like actually talented. What it would mean to separate art from that kind of performance, and then what it means on the couch in terms of liberation. And so that's also, in a way, this return to the questions that were offered from over here, too.
Great, we're gonna have time for 2 more questions. So I have one here, and then do we have another one on deck for? Okay, well, we'll see. Here we go. Here I come. Maybe meet me in the middle.
Hi, thank you both so much. Jameson, when you were talking about the concept, like Lacan's concept of writing and analysis as like related to this act of gathering up these things that have washed up on the shore, and like specifically trash. I was wondering about the role of both poetry and analysis in like recuperating or revaluing language that specifically is discarded or deemed valueless.
Absolutely. No, I mean, again, with the question of interpretation, I think Lacan was really, he really pushed something in this domain that's very important to me. I mean, even in locating the primal scene as a scene of language, the idea was that what you do with the hearing is you hear something in the speech. I mean, it's the old idea of parapraxis to an extent, right? That you say one thing and then another meaning becomes clear. But he wanted to go in there and pick it up and hear it and push it and make it sing and make it ring, or sort of maybe hit you over the head a little bit with it, but it's with the language. And then even the idea that the transgenerational threads can be heard best there, and that they would resound the best there in language. Not the story of this happened and then that happened and then here I am, but something that somehow you didn't understand was already present in the speaking voice that gets heard in the moment of speaking with somebody immediately. Not that you go home and think about, but that happens in that encounter, in the room itself, and how that can change everything for someone. I mean, this maybe sounds very idealistic in some senses, but I do believe in it.
I do believe in it as a good way to end an event about both poetry and psychoanalysis, in my opinion.
Okay, beautiful. Let's go off into the night. Thank you again to Jameson and Hannah. Come back to the Poetry Project. We have lots more readings this spring. See you all soon.